Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 156 and it's titled It's Just One Aura, How Bad Could It Be? And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or working with a suggested card from one of our patrons, channel members, or viewers, building this on a budget of $100 or less and making an entire Magic the Gathering Commander deck around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is going to be completely random, not suggested to us, and that card is 1,000 Lashes. And 1,000 Lashes is 2 white-black for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated, and at the beginning of the upkeep of enchanted creature's controller, that player loses 1 life. So when I started putting this deck together, there were a couple of commanders that I was really looking at. Obviously, we're in Orzhov. We could add some colors, but I opted not to. And I figured the commander that was going to work the best with putting auras on our opponent's creatures was going to be Eriette of the Charmed Apple. So Eriette is 1 white-black for a 2/4 legendary creature, human warlock. Each creature that's enchanted by an aura you control can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of auras you control. I figured Eriette was probably our best bet for a commander for this deck, because even though 1,000 Lashes prevents a creature from attacking, it still drains that player at the beginning of their end step, in the same way that Eriette is going to drain out all of our opponents in our end step. So it felt very thematic, and it felt like it was a great way to build kind of an Orzhov enchantment prison-style deck. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of our themes for this deck. Obviously, starting with our first theme, you can probably guess what it is. It is enchantments. And specifically, we're focusing in on auras, and when I landed on Eriette as our commander, I realized putting a bunch of pacifism effects on our opponent's creatures isn't really what we want to be doing, because Eriette prevents them from attacking us if they're enchanted by our auras, so we may as well actually buff up our opponent's creatures so they're more incentivized to attack each other, leaving us to just kind of sit there and pillow fort our way up and eventually win the game through draining people with Eriette's ability. So with that in mind, we have cards like Ethereal Armor, which is 1 white for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and has first strike. Ideally, we're going to have a ton of auras, so Ethereal Armor is going to be giving a creature a ton of boosts, but at the same time, it's giving it first strike, which makes it a menace to deal with in combat, because now our opponents are forced to kind of chump block something that they may not have been expecting because they didn't know we were going to put an aura on it, and it prevents whatever is attacking from attacking us, so it's kind of a win-win either way. Additionally, since we're playing so many auras, we also need to find ways to benefit from casting those auras. One of the nice things about white is that it gets a lot of card draw effects from playing specific spells, enchantments, and auras being among them. So because of that, we get to take advantage of cards like Shram Senior Edificer, which is 1 and a white for a 2/2 Dwarf Advisor. Whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. Now, we have mostly auras. There's a couple of equipment in here and no vehicles, so we really are leaning into the auras pretty heavily. But Shram is a great source of card advantage because every single aura we are casting is now replacing itself if he's on the battlefield. It doesn't have to target our things, it just has to be cast. And there's a couple of other spells that do something very similar, so we should have no problem with card advantage in this deck. And then finally, we get to our last theme for this deck, which is going to be protecting ourselves. One of the biggest ways that we can actually wind up losing this game is if we enchant our opponent's creatures, make them super tough to deal with, make them super big, and then someone kills Eriette, and now our opponents can attack us with the creatures that we have buffed up. We have to make sure that that is not going to be able to happen, and one of the best ways we can do that is through protection spells and fog effects like Holy Day. So Holy Day is 1 white mana for an instant, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. We want to have as many ways as possible to disincentivize our opponents from attacking us, because we just want to sit there with Eriette in play and drain our opponents out every single turn. Really, we don't even want to be attacking that much. We want our opponents to be doing the attacking for us. So if we can kind of throw in a holy day once in a while to make our opponents think that even if we don't have Eriette, they still probably shouldn't attack us, that means that we can execute our game plan that much more effectively. But those are all of our themes for this week, and so moving on to the next piece of our deck tech, we've got to talk a little bit about some key cards in the deck. These are the cards that synergize really well with what we're trying to do, and in a lot of cases actually wind up being some of our win conditions or value pieces. So our first key card that we're going to talk about is going to be Killian Ink Duelist. Now, when I started putting this deck together, I was considering two separate commanders for this. I was looking at Eriette, and I was also looking at Killian. I knew that whichever one I didn't put in the command zone was going to make it into the deck, so I did want to highlight Killian as well, because I do think he's a phenomenal card for this deck and could honestly be the commander, but that means that we're focusing more on our own Voltron strategy rather than buffing up our opponent's creatures, so I decided to try something a little different. However, with that being said, Killian is still amazing for what we're trying to do. Killian is a white and a black for a 2/2 human warlock. He's got lifelink, menace, and spells you cast that target a creature cost 2 less to cast. That does not specify that it has to be our creatures or our opponent's creatures, so now all of our auras, because they are targeting a creature, are costing 2 less to cast. That is a huge piece of ramp that can come down as early as turn 2, and essentially allow us on turn 3, when we untap with 3 mana, to then play a 5 mana aura, and that is really where a lot of the power comes from in this deck, are the more expensive auras, because they're going to give our opponent's creatures abilities that benefit us. They're going to let us draw cards. They're going to be doing a lot more damage. Killian is a great way to speed up the deck and really put a lot of the damage that we can do into overdrive. However, he's not the only key card in the deck, obviously, so we're also going to talk a little bit about Ardenn Intrepid Archaeologist, and Ardenn was another card that I looked at for a commander, but I couldn't find a great black partner that I wanted to pair him with, so we decided to just leave Ardenn on his own, put him in the deck instead. But Ardenn is 2 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature Core Scout. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may attach any number of auras and equipment you control to target permanent or player. This is a great way to really just reorganize the battlefield and make sure that whatever we perceive as the biggest threat has the tools to become the biggest threat for everyone except for ourselves. Because we can choose any number of auras we've got, we can move them all to one big creature, and now our opponents really want to attack with that creature because it's probably really big, gets some great benefits when it attacks, and it still can't attack us because of Eriette. On the other hand, too, if we've gotten to the point where we've really kind of slowed the game down, maybe we're down to just one opponent, we can actually take all the auras from their things, from the stuff that we've spread around the board, and put them all onto one of our creatures, maybe something like Killian, which has lifelink and menace, and is therefore pretty good to hold a bunch of auras, or someone like Eriette to knock someone out with commander damage, and then all of a sudden we become the aggressive deck at the table, being able to take all of the auras that we've been spreading around and turn them into benefits for us and take away those buffs from our opponents. So Ardenn is a great way to just close out the game, and it's also a great way to make sure we're always protected from the biggest threat at the table. Now, finally, we got to talk about our last key card, and this one is going to be Retether. So Retether, 3 and a white for a sorcery, return each aura card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Only creatures can be enchanted this way. This is one of the best cards in the entire deck because there is a very good chance that we put auras on creatures and maybe a board wipe happens and all those creatures die, so all our auras go to the graveyard, or maybe someone just removes a big threat that had a bunch of auras on it, or someone destroys all the enchantments. Whatever it may be, there's a very good chance that throughout the course of the game, we will have quite a few enchantments and auras wind up in the graveyard, and being able to cast Retether for just 4 mana to get them all back out of nowhere can really tip the tide in our favor. If we have, say, maybe even just 5 auras in our graveyard, we can cast Eriette, cast Retether, put them all on Eriette, even if she's the only creature in play, and then drain everybody for 5 at the end of our turn. And if we're doing that pretty consistently, then our opponents aren't going to last very long. So Retether is kind of like a huge one-shot kill at the end of a turn, or maybe just a great way to re-buy some of our effects. So those are all of our key cards for this week. And the next thing I want to do for our deck tech is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize really well together and create fun and unique play experiences, and sometimes are just fun cards that I want to highlight. So the first of our cool interactions is going to be between Pariah and Shielded by Faith. So this is a bit of a unique combination of cards because we can put these enchantments onto our creatures, but we can also put them onto our opponent's creatures if we want. It doesn't really matter where they go. So starting off with Pariah, it's 2 and a white for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. All damage that would be dealt to you is dealt to enchanted creature instead. So if our opponents have a huge threat, we can just throw Pariah on it. Someone attacks us, we should take, say, 15 damage, but instead that 15 damage goes to our opponent's creature. And then, of course, the downside there is that it's killing that creature, so we can't do it again. That is, of course, unless we include Shielded by Faith, which is 1 white for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature has indestructible, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you may attach Shielded by Faith to that creature. This essentially creates an infinite lock where if a creature is dealt damage, it's not going to die because it's now indestructible. So if we put Pariah on that creature, all damage that we would take gets dealt to the enchanted creature. And since the enchanted creature is indestructible, it can't die, and we can continue to do this for the entire game. Now, obviously, it can be disrupted if someone exiles the creature. That's not going to help us. If we get milled out, that's not going to help us. Or if someone destroys the enchantments, that's not going to help us. But for the most part, if we are facing down some aggressive decks, or maybe decks that want to focus on killing their opponents with combat damage, this is a great way to buy at least a few turns, and is also a great way to protect some creatures too. Because if we put this on Eriette, she becomes a lot harder to remove, but we're still draining our opponents for at least 2, provided we have no other auras, every single turn. So while this isn't technically a win condition, it typically buys us enough time to find a win condition or slowly grinds out the game, and prevents some decks from entirely being able to win the game because some decks just cannot get rid of this combo of cards. That is, though, not our only cool interaction that we're going to talk about, so let's take a look at our second cool interaction, and this one is going to be between Dawn Evangel and Hateful Eidolon. So Dawn Evangel is 2 and a white for a 2/3 enchantment creature human cleric. Whenever a creature dies, if an aura you controlled was attached to it, return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. And then we can partner that up with Hateful Eidolon, which is 1 black for a 1/2 enchantment creature spirit. It's got lifelink. Whenever an enchanted creature dies, draw a card for each aura you controlled that was attached to it. This is a great way to make sure we always have some sort of card advantage. Because most of the time when we are enchanting creatures, we want to be enchanting our opponent's creatures. So if we're putting auras on them, that now incentivizes our other opponents to try to kill that creature because it can't attack us and it can only attack them. But if it's killed with Hateful Eidolon in play, we get to draw cards for each aura that was attached to it, and then Dawn Evangel can also get any creature back with 2 or less mana from our graveyard to our hand, which could be the Hateful Eidolon. But essentially this is a, not loop necessarily, but a way to continue accruing value throughout the course of the game with very cheap creatures and just by playing our game plan. Being able to enchant our opponent's creatures and then get back our own creatures and get back a bunch of cards that we may have had to spend. is a great way to help us survive into the late game, and a great way to just keep getting threats back and keep getting problem cards back that our opponents think they may have dealt with. So that is all of our cool interactions that I wanted to talk about for this deck. And for the last piece of this deck tech, we have to talk a little bit about the price of the deck. And this week, it actually came in almost halfway through our budget limit at $55.86, with a good chunk of that coming from Songbird's Blessing, which is $4.96. So if you are looking to trim the deck price down to almost exactly $50, you can cut out Songbird's Blessing. However, given the strength of this card, I would highly recommend keeping it in if you have the space for it, because it is 3 and a white for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature attacks, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an aura card. You may put that card onto the battlefield. If you don't, put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Essentially, we can put this onto one of our opponent's creatures, they can then attack somebody else, and we will still get the trigger because it's not giving the ability to the creature, it's giving the ability to the enchantment. So as long as that creature attacks, we get the effect from it. And that gives us a free aura when they attack, which can then come into play and possibly make their creature even bigger, hitting an opponent for even more damage. Or we can always put it on one of our own creatures, maybe that has indestructible or has protection from creatures or some way to get through in combat damage. So we can just continuously get more and more value out of this. But like I said, it is almost $5, so if you did need to trim it for budget purposes, there are a ton of sweet Orzhov auras out there that you can easily find a spot for in this deck. However, if you're looking for a card to put into this deck that's a little bit out of the budget, I do have a suggestion there for you as well. So this week, the card that I would recommend putting in if you don't mind the budget upgrade is Delny Streetwise Lookout. And yes, I know she does not technically break the budget restriction so far. If we put her in, we'd still be under the $100, but I didn't want to go too far over the budget for this. So Delny is 2 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature human scout. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater, and if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. There are a lot of creatures in this deck that have power 2 or less, most importantly being Eriette. If we move to our end step and we have 5 auras in play with Eriette and Delny, each opponent's going to lose 10 life because Eriette's ability is going to trigger twice, meaning that we can close out games incredibly quickly just with Delny, Eriette, and some auras. So obviously it works well with a bunch of other cards in the deck as well, but I would recommend including it even just for Eriette because I do think that is an incredibly powerful way to speed up the deck and make it much more effective at what it's trying to do. However, if you are putting a new card in, like Delny, you would have to take a card out. So the card that I would recommend taking out is Aspect of Gorgon, which is 2 and a black for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+3 and has Death Touch. Now, normally, since we want to be enchanting our opponent's creatures and making sure that they are not attacking us, we want to be putting our auras on our opponent's creatures, but Aspect of Gorgon is one of the few that really wants to go on our own creatures, because giving a creature a huge boost to their toughness and giving them Death Touch is a very defensive card, but we don't want to really be enchanting our own things, so it kind of plays in this weird space where we want to put it on an opponent's creature, but we also want to put it on our own creature. And either way, it's not that great. Being able to have Death Touch is phenomenal when we're trying to defend, but as bad as it sounds, if we're kind of blocking with our creatures, we're already probably losing the game. We want to make sure that there's nothing attacking us, which is why Aspect of Gorgon would go on someone else's creature. So there's a lot of confusion with this card, so for all intents and purposes, it's a good card, it's just not quite what we're looking for in this deck. So I do think Delny, especially at the same mana cost, is going to be a much more powerful card for the deck. Now, with all of that being said, let's check out how this deck performs in a game and actually see it in action. Before we get to that, though, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out a lot. But you can also find us on a bunch of other social media sites. You can send us an email. And of course, you can join us on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, or right here on YouTube as a channel member, joining the amazing people such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to everyone who is a current patron and channel member, thank you all so much. And if you would like to join those amazing people, you can get access to things like the deck lists a week early, you can get the unedited gameplay videos, you can get the guarantee from me that any of the cards you suggest will be turned into videos eventually, and of course you get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the games and also play the games on this channel. So if that is something you're interested in, please do check us out. And if not, I completely understand. You can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does really help out. So with all of that being said, let's check out who we're going to be testing our deck against this week, because we have 3 opponents, and we are going to be running this deck up against Zimone and Dina, being played by Bilal, Jin-Gitaxias, being played by Doodle, and Tanazir Quandrix, being played by Mike. So starting off with Bilal's Zimone and Dina deck, this is a new deck from Bilal. It is a mix between aristocrats and landfall because he wants to be sacrificing a bunch of creatures so that he can trigger Zimone and Dina, but at the same time he wants to be making a lot of landfall because he wants to be able to trigger Zimone and Dina multiple times and draw multiple cards and trigger those kinds of effects. So this really feels like a Sultai value engine, and in Bilal's hands, that is a very scary prospect because he is very efficient at playing very value-heavy decks. So I am definitely concerned about this. In all honesty, though, I'm not as concerned about Zimone and Dina as I am about Doodle's Jin-Gitaxias deck. And this is going to seem a little bit strange, but Jin-Gitaxias here is actually a bit of a sneak peek at a deck tech that's coming from us in about 2 weeks, because this Jin-Gitaxias deck was suggested to us by Doodle, and he and I worked on building this deck together, so he is pretty much playing a deck that we will be doing a deck tech on in the future. And with that being said, that means I know exactly what is in this deck, and I am terrified of it. Because Jin-Gitaxias, while being an amazing commander, is not why Doodle's playing this in the command zone. He's playing it in the command zone because it transforms into the Great Synthesis. And there's a very unique strategy here, because you may notice the Great Synthesis is an enchantment, but it is not a legendary enchantment. That means that the Great Synthesis can be copied and immediately trigger step number 1 again to draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand. Doodle aims to take advantage of this by playing a bunch of copy effects to draw a ton of cards and use something in the cards that he draws to win the game. Now, I won't give away too much of the deck because we will be doing a full deck tech on it in 2 weeks, like I just said. So if you're interested, check back with the channel in a couple of weeks to see the full deck tech, but that is definitely the deck that I am the most concerned about in this game, simply because I know exactly what's in it. And then last but not least, we have Mike playing Tanazir Quandrix, another really terrifying deck, especially coming from Mike, because Mike is very proficient in finding small ways to kind of eke out huge value engines. And so I am very concerned about Tanazir Quandrix when it hits the battlefield, being able to just dump a ton of +1/+1 counters on things and then make things super, super big kind of out of nowhere. So I am a little concerned about that. Plus, I'm sure Mike is packing a little bit of control in there as ways to make sure that his big dragon can get through and damage. So I'm very interested to see how this deck performs, but a little bit concerned as well. So with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments who you think is going to win this game. I'm very excited to see how this goes. Hopefully Eriette can put up a good show, but let me know what you all think. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Bilal, Doodle, and then Mike. On my first turn, I play a swamp. Bilal plays a command tower. Doodle plays an island and cast wizard class, gaining no maximum hand size. Mike plays a command tower. I play a Plains and cast Marble Diamond. Bilal plays an island. Doodle plays an island and casts Essior Wardwing Familiar, making spells his opponents cast that target his commander cost 3 more to cast. Then, at the end of turn, Mike casts Once Upon a Time for free since it's the first spell he's cast this game. This lets him look at the top 5 cards of his library, revealing a creature or land, putting it into his hand and the rest to the bottom. This has him putting Armored Scrapgorger into his hand. Mike plays a Crystal Grotto, scrying 1, then casts the Armored Scrapgorger, which gets an oil counter when it's tapped, exiles a card from a graveyard, and gets +3/+0 when it has 3 or more oil counters. I play a Plains and cast an Arcane Signet, followed up by casting my commander Eriette of the Charmed Apple, preventing my opponent's creatures from attacking me if they're enchanted by an aura I control, and in my end step, each opponent loses X life while I gain X life, where X is the number of auras I control. Bilal plays an island and casts his commander Zimone and Dina, letting him gain 2 life and have target opponent lose 2 life whenever he draws his second card each turn, and they can also tap to sacrifice a creature, letting Bilal draw a card and put a land from his hand into play, repeating the process once if he controls more than 8 lands. Doodle plays an island and casts Midnight Clock, getting an hour counter in each upkeep, and letting him exile it to shuffle his hand and graveyard into his library, drawing 7 new cards when there are 12 hour counters on it. He then moves to combat, attacking Mike for 1 with Essior. Mike plays a Bonder's Enclave and casts In Search of Greatness, so in his upkeep he can put a permanent from his hand into play for free if it has mana value equal to 1 plus the highest mana value among permanents he controls, and if he doesn't, he scries 1. I cast a Transcendent Envoy, making my aura spells cost 1 less to cast, then cast Aspect of Gorgon, enchanting Essior, giving it +1/+3 and Death Touch. Then at the end of my turn, each opponent loses a life while I gain a life, since I now control 1 aura. On Bilal's turn, he plays a forest. Doodle plays an island. In Mike's upkeep, he scries 1, then casts Up the Beanstalk, drawing a card when it enters and whenever he casts a spell with mana value 5 or greater. In response though, Bilal flashes in Frilled Mystic, countering the spell and preventing Mike from drawing a card. Still in response, Doodle flashes in Thrix the Sudden Storm, making his spells with mana value 5 or greater cost 1 less and making them unable to be countered. On my turn, I cast Hero of Iroas, making my auras cost 1 less to cast and putting a +1/+1 counter on the hero whenever I target him with a spell. I then cast Fallen Ideal, enchanting Thrix, giving it flying, letting Doodle sacrifice a creature to give it +2/+1 until the end of turn, and also returning the enchantment to my hand when Thrix dies. Then at the end of my turn, each of my opponents loses 2 life while I gain 2 life. Still at the end of turn, Bilal activates Zimone and Dina, sacrificing the Mystic to draw a card and put an Ice Tunnel into play tapped. Then, when he untaps for turn, Bilal casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand, then plays an island and casts Cultivate, again searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand. Doodle casts his commander Jin-Gitaxias, letting him draw a card when he casts a non-creature spell, mana value 3 or greater, and transform it for 4 mana if he has 7 or more cards in hand. He then plays a Myriad Landscape and attacks Bilal for 4 with Thrix. In Mike's upkeep, he scries 1, then casts Ghostly Pilferer, letting him draw a card whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, and also lets Mike pay 2 when it untaps to draw a card. I cast an Orzhov Signet, then cast Open the Armory, letting me search my library for an aura or equipment, putting it into my hand. This lets me get Sage's Reverie, casting it and enchanting Mike's Ghostly Pilferer, giving it +1/+1 for each aura I control, and also drawing a card when it enters for each aura I control, which is currently 3. I then play a Plains, and before I moved my end step, Mike cast Rapid Hybridization to destroy Eriette and give me a 3/3 Frog Lizard token. In response, I cast Benevolent Blessing, enchanting Eriette and giving her protection from blue, saving her. Then when I moved my end step, I now control 4 auras, so I gain 4 life, and each of my opponents lose 4 life. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Royal Warden, making 2 tapped 2/2 Necron Warrior creature tokens when it enters. He then also evokes a Muldrifter, drawing 2 cards and sacrificing it when it enters the battlefield. In response to the sacrifice trigger though, Bilal activates his commander, using it to sacrifice the Muldrifter, draw a card, and put a forest into play. Then, since he controls more than 8 lands, he repeats the process, drawing another card and putting another forest into play. Then he also has me lose 2 life for drawing his second card this turn. Once that's resolved, he casts Soul Ring and uses that to cast Talisman of Resilience. In Doodle's upkeep, Midnight Clock hits 12 counters, so it gets exiled. He shuffles his hand and graveyard into his library and draws 7 new cards. He then plays an island and casts a Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size, and casts Teferi's Tutelage, drawing a card with Jin-Gitaxias, milling target opponent for 2 whenever he draws a card, then drawing a card and discarding a card when it enters the battlefield, this time milling me for 2. On Mike's turn, he activates Ghostly Pilferer, discarding his own Jin-Gitaxias to make the spirit unblockable this turn, letting him attack Doodle with it for 6. I play a Swamp and cast a Charcoal Diamond, then move straight to my end step, making each opponent lose 4 life while I gain 4 life, thanks to Eriette. Bilal casts Jol-Rayal Monvoli Recluse, letting him make a 2/2 cat token whenever he draws his second card each turn. He then activates Zimonandina, sacrificing a Necron token to draw a card, put a Rimewood Falls into play, then repeat the process, drawing another card but not putting a land into play. Since Bilal draws his second card this turn this way, he also has me lose 2 life and makes a cat token. After that resolves, he casts Glistening Dawn, incubating 12 twice because he controls 12 lands. He also casts Awakening Zone, making a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token in his upkeep. When Doodle draws for his turn, he mills Bilal for 2 cards, then he levels up Wizard class to level 2, drawing 2 more cards and having Bilal and I each mill 2 more cards. He then activates Jin-Gitaxias, transforming it into the Great Synthesis. In response though, I cast Path to Exile, paying an extra 5 mana for both Essior and Jin, exiling Doodle's commander and letting him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. At the end of turn, Mike taps Armored Scrapgorger, putting an oil counter on it, exiling Royal Elemental from Bilal's graveyard. He uses that mana to activate Bonder's Enclave, drawing a card. Then, in Mike's upkeep, he activates the Scrapgorger again, putting another oil counter on it and exiling Titan of Industry from Bilal's graveyard. He also pays 2 mana when Ghostly Pilferer becomes untapped, drawing another card, and scries 1 in his upkeep. I cast Grasp of the Hieromancer, enchanting Ghostly Pilferer, giving it +1/+1 and tapping a creature when it attacks. In my end step, Eriette triggers, making each opponent lose 5 life while I gain 5 life. Bilal also activates his Incubate tokens, turning them into 12/12 creatures. In Bilal's upkeep, he makes an Eldrazi spawn token, then casts Urza Lord High Artificer, making a construct token with power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts he controls, which is 5. He also activates Zimonandina, sacrificing Royal Warden to draw a card, putting a forest into play, repeating the process, drawing another card, and not putting a land into play. Then, since he drew a second card, he makes a cat token and does 2 damage to me. After that, he casts Poison Tip Archer, making each opponent lose a life whenever a creature dies, and attacks me for 24 with his Incubate tokens. When Doodle draws for turn, he mills Bilal for 2, plays an island, and casts Extravagant Replication, letting him make a token copy of a non-land permanent he controls in his upkeep. In Mike's upkeep, he scries 1, then plays a Breeding Pool untapped, paying 2 life. I cast a Spirit Mantle, enchanting Eriette, giving her +1/+1 and protection from creatures. At the end of turn, Bilal activates Urza's ability, paying 5 to shuffle his library and exile the top card of his library, being able to play it without paying its mana cost, but it's an island so it stays in exile. Then Eriette also triggers, making each of my opponents lose 6 life while I gain 6 life. In Bilal's upkeep, he makes an Eldrazi spawn token, then cast Hangerback Walker for X=6, entering with 6 +1/+1 counters and making 6 1/1 Thopter tokens when it dies. Unfortunately for Bilal, Mike has a response, countering the Walker with Artistic Refusal. Bilal, though, able to respond, countering the refusal with Disdainful Stroke, allowing his Hangerback Walker to resolve. He then activates Simone and Dina, sacrificing the Walker to make 6 Thopters, making each opponent lose a life, drawing a card, putting an island into play, repeating this process, drawing another card, not putting a land into play, making me lose 2 life, and making a cat token. He then attacks me for 24 with both of his Incubate tokens, and I block with Eriette and the Hero of Iroas, killing the hero but taking no damage, while each of Bilal's opponents lose a life because of the Poison Tip Archer. At the end of turn, Doodle cast Reality Shift, exiling Poison Tip Archer and letting Bilal manifest the top card of his library. In response, Bilal sacrifices his 3 Eldrazi spawn to make 3 colorless mana and make each opponent lose 3 life. In Doodle's upkeep, Extravagant Replication makes a copy of Teferi's Tutelage, which enters so Doodle draws a card, discards a card, and triggers both tutelages, milling Bilal for 4. Then when he draws for turn, he mills Bilal for 4 more, and recasts his commander Jin-Gitaxias, letting Mike draw a card with Ghostly Pilferer. He immediately transforms Jin into the Great Synthesis, drawing 7 cards since he has 7 cards in his hand, milling Bilal for 28 total cards and gaining no maximum hand size for as long as the Great Synthesis is in play. In Mike's upkeep, he scries 1, then plays a Mosswort Bridge, hiding away a card. He then discards Avenger of Zendikar to make Ghostly Pilferer unblockable until the end of turn, and this lets him attack Bilal for 9, tapping a Thopter when he attacks. On my turn, I cast a Heliod's Pilgrim, searching my library for an aura and putting it into my hand. This lets me get all that glitters, casting it and enchanting Eriette to give her +1/+1 for each enchantment and artifact I have, which is currently 12. I then attack Bilal for 15 damage with Eriette since she has protection from creatures, knocking him out of the game. Then I move to my end step, gaining 7 life with Eriette and making each of my opponents lose 7 life, putting Mike to 3 and Doodle to only 1. In Doodle's upkeep, Extravagant Replication copies the Great Synthesis, letting him draw 14 cards since he has 14 cards in hand, milling me for 56 total cards. Then he draws for turn, milling me for an additional 4. This also puts another lore counter on the original Great Synthesis, returning all non-Phyrexian creatures to their owner's hands. Doodle then plays an island and casts Mirror Maid, having it enter as a copy of the Great Synthesis, this time drawing 27 cards, milling Mike and I for a combined total of 108 cards, which is more than enough to mill us both completely out, knocking each of us out on our turns when we go to draw, winning Doodle the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on in this game, and it was very difficult to notice, but Mike was missing quite a few of his land drops, so unfortunately he didn't play as big a role in the game as I'm sure he was hoping. He really had to try to stick just a couple of huge threats or play big counter spells, and it didn't quite work out for him. Hopefully next time we see Tanazir, we get to see some more land drops and get to see a little bit more of what Mike is bringing to the table, because the deck looked super sweet. And I feel like I've said this before, but Armored Scrapgorger, every time I see that card, I am more and more impressed by it. Same thing with Ghostly Pilferer. Really, Mike's deck just played a lot of cards that I was like, man, I should be playing a lot of these cards more, which I always love from Mike's deck building, so it's always nice to see that. Next up, though, I suppose we can talk about our own deck. We did pretty well. I think that overall we were very close to winning the game. If Doodle hadn't gone off on that last turn, I think the game was probably ours. And I do remember the final turn of that game. I had cast the All That Glitters in an attempt to knock Bilal out of the game, and Mike said that he would let it resolve provided I didn't kill him or Doodle, so I wasn't able to play the final enchantment that I had in my hand, which would have taken Doodle out of the game at the time, but gotta live up to my deals, and knock out one person's still pretty good, and I think that we probably would have still died either way, so I don't think it really played too much of a difference in the end. Bilal's deck also very strong. It was very impressive to see all of the landfall synergies, and also very cool to see how quickly he was able to hit 8 mana to trigger Zimone and Dina twice each turn, and then playing cards like Jor-El to benefit from drawing multiple cards and being able to trigger a lot of landfall synergies. It was a very sweet deck, definitely a very Bilal style deck, so hopefully we'll get to see that deck again in the future as well. And then finally, of course, we gotta talk about our winner. Gotta talk about Jin-Gitaxias and the Great Synthesis played by Doodle. Well, I mean, what can I really say other than it did exactly what it wanted to do? The fact that Doodle was able to get the Great Synthesis essentially to trigger 3 times on the first lore counter, very, very impressive, being able to draw 7, then 14, then 27 cards just from his commander was super, super strong. And being able to mill everybody out is not the typical game plan for that deck. It is definitely one of the game plans, but it was super cool to see, very cool to see it go off, and very proud that a deck that I built won a game, but it is weird that I wasn't the one playing it when it won the game. So like I said, if you're looking into a more in-depth deck tech on that Jin-Gitaxias deck, check back in about 2 weeks where we'll have it on this channel, and of course, that means we gotta have another game with it as well. So if you want to see it piloted once again, this time from my perspective, check back in a couple weeks. But a huge congrats to Doodle for the victory. So with all of that being said, I hope you all liked the deck tech. I hope you liked the game. I know I certainly did. I thought it was a ton of fun. So let me know down in the comments what you think. Let me know if there's any cards you want to see me build around in the future. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.